Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 1st of November, and today we're going to look at many parts of the front line, once again beginning with the Uspenivka direction, working our way to the northeast, and we'll eventually finish off with Vovchansk. So I want to zoom in and begin looking at additional Russian advances that are occurring just south of the village of Maksymivka. This is important because it shows that there is continued Russian pressure and a near complete capture of the ridge, which again we talked about it extensively in earlier videos, branches out from Vuhledar all the way in this diagonal northwestern direction, and it sort of fizzles out around Maksymivka, just south of it, around Novokranka, around Yazna Polyana. And so now the Russian forces, they're really turning this into a permanent base of operation, and they're creating depth around it. And what this means is that any villages or any positions on the line of contact that the Ukrainians still maintain that are near Maksymivka, those are really in a compromised position as they're being overlooked directly by the Russian forces without really any obstacles hindering their view. So there's going to be a really good vantage point for the Russian side to set up over here in these fields between Novokranka and Vovchansk, not just for this village, but also for the road that connects it to Uspenivka, and more generally all the villages around here that are in really serious danger. So there are initial reports from the pro-Russian side of Russian attacks towards the village itself, and you can see that it is relatively isolated given the Russian momentum by the 29th Combined Arms Army and 5th Tank Brigade over the past week in this region. It would make sense for them to continue their advances along this specific paved road, which then moves into the southern part of the village directly. So definitely that is a possibility. On the other hand, you have the Ukrainians moving in reinforcements from the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, as we talked about yesterday. So now they've been operating here for maybe a week or even more based on what we know publicly. And so they're, getting used to this region for the first time throughout the course of the war, and doing so in tandem with the 123rd Mykolaiv Territorial Defense Brigade, which is relatively active around here as well. And again, as I said before, this village is not connected to the wider structure of Ukrainian defenses because you do have the Sukhy Yali River. The Sukhy Yali River, it branches out from the Vovcha River to the north, so then it just goes south of Andriivka and passes through Uspenivka all the way to the current line of contact. The Ukrainians actually did build some trenches that you see on the map marked in X over here on the northern bank of that river. So there is a contingency plan if the Russians were to advance from this vertical direction over here, because after the river, once the Russians would theoretically be able to capture the villages and cross over the river, they would encounter some sort of static defense that the Ukrainians could fall back to. And that was meant to be a stopgap measure to prevent the Russians from advancing from the south and reaching Kurakhove and its perimeter from that direction. So in that regard, you do have some Ukrainian prepared defensive positions, but then you're looking at areas further south. You're looking at this large-scale salient, which is actually on pretty high elevation, not any depth over here in terms of defenses. And the Ukrainians here are very close to being cut off from being squeezed out of their positions here. So that's something to keep in mind. And by doing so, it's inviting the Russians to begin assaults from two axes onto the villages over here on this chain of villages. So, of course, from the height to the south, and also from the main route that they've been utilizing for their large-scale columns that are largely defended by the 79th Air Assault Brigade and some other units around here. So then those two will converge in addition to the axis from Vovchansk around Uspenivka. That's something that's definitely occurring. And then you could see how disconnected that is from Maksymivka. After Maksymivka, if you're looking at it, you have a measurement of, like 6 kilometers northwards before you reach Sukhy Yali, which is named after the river. And then after that, really, you're looking at no other villages in the immediate vicinity until you go 8.5 kilometers northwards to Shevchenko and those outskirts. You, of course, have the Sukhy Yali River itself and the valley running along it, leading directly into Andriivka. Again, not many defensive positions prepared in this region. To the east, definitely there is a certain density, but then you see this specific area that runs from Rozdolnie to the western outskirts of Kurakhove, this like 15-kilometer range, which is so much less defended in the surrounding regions. And it just is really interesting to keep in mind because I believe some of it may have to do with the Ukrainians overestimating the amount of time that they would have held on to Vuhledar. that could play a role in it. So they focused on building up defenses out in areas to the east or to the west because perhaps they thought that the situation was more incumbent upon them to do so in those regions. And then they really relied upon Vuhledar and dragging out the battle over there until they would eventually be able to focus on this 15-kilometer region. But now definitely they're not going to have the ability to do so, because if the Ukrainians sent in logistics regiments, which they've been doing more so on the border between Dnipro and Donetsk to the north here, I would say it's west of Pokrovsk mainly, but if they were to move them deeper into Ukrainian territory closer to the front line, they would be targeted by the Russian Air Force. Russian Air Force is, of course, active around here. Large-scale artillery and FPV strikes would be going against any sort of Ukrainian force that would be within, let's say, I don't know, 15, 20 kilometers of the front line. It would just be very, very easy to detect them. And any sort of operation to excavate or dig, it would require so much equipment and so many men to do it on a large scale. And that would be very easy to detect for an already advancing Russian force in an area that is completely open, besides some tree lines which provide only concealment, not actual cover. So it is a very difficult situation looking into the future in this area, especially when you look at the paved roads over here and how they lead directly into Andriivka's southern outskirts. So that's really something to keep in mind when it comes to the Russian advance. As we talked about, it's a 22 square kilometer gain, just further consolidation of positions north of Novoukrayinka. Really, as we said before, it's not feasible for the Ukrainians to maintain control over here. It means that now there is a direct connection between Novoukrayinka and Bukhoevlenka, which will further embolden them to continue their advances northward. To look a bit to the east, now you're seeing the Russians uptaking the intensity of attacks in this region, this sort of salient that is southeast of Kurakhove. It does not have the most density in terms of defenses, although a lot of these tree lines, you don't see it on satellite imagery, but they were built up, maybe not with like these very wide trenches, but with some dugouts individually, and it's hard to weed them out. But also you have the 33rd Brigade over here. They've really played a huge role in keeping the coherency of the Ukrainian line of contact, maintaining a solid line in tandem with the 31st Brigade. So they've been involved in just infantry being stationed there, but also sending in a lot of Western vehicles to engage in counterattacks or to hold the line. The Russians, they've spent the past 2 or 3 weeks storming this specific line of defense, which is located north of Uspenivka. For a very long time, this fortress was impregnable, so the Russians, they focused on 3 axes of attack from Pobieda, from the east and from the south, and they were able to get footholds into this wide trench line, get some operational control over the highway that you see over here with this arrow, and now they've been able to take over the entirety of the defensive width. So it's a 0.7 square kilometer gain, but that's not the end of it. There is still this salient, which I suppose is connected to Antonivka, that village that you see in the bottom left corner of the screen. And the salient itself is like 3 kilometers wide. A lot of tree lines over here. So you're going to have to see additional Russian armored advances with MTLBs, BTRs, BMDs dismounting Russian soldiers with tank cover. And that will, of course, lead to more Ukrainian attempts to send in FPV strikes, really fix artillery strikes, and then see actual vehicle-on-vehicle confrontations by the 33rd Brigade, because this is largely an open area, and it's one of those regions which is actually conducive for those sorts of combats. Because more generally, if you're looking at this axis where you see the 2 arrows going towards, not only does it overlook the trench line on the Sukhi Yali River Valley and trenches, but also it provides a really good axis, this really good southern flank through which to get control over the, I suppose, preambulatory positions before reaching Kurakhove itself. Because if you look at this rectangle over here, it is a large-scale area. Some of it is on higher elevation, some sort of local hills. And then from there, you do have a wide flank spanning all the way from Hostra to the north to the south. If we're going to be generous, let's say like 5 kilometers more than what is currently under Russian control. And it would give the Russians a really broad front through which to attack towards Kurakhove. But really, that is more so looking into the future. A lot of it may not even matter if Kurakhove has enough pressure on it at the present moment, and a lot of the attacks are going to be more concentrated, coming from a few specific corridors, like Ostrivska, coming west from Maksymivka, perhaps coming from this highway over here. And then everything that I just said about these fields over here would become redundant, because really the Ukrainians holding on would be extremely difficult if the main artery that reaches them, Kurakhove, would be under direct assault. Regardless of that, the Russian forces have also taken over some additional fields south of Maksymivka, amounting to 1.67 square kilometers. But moving northwards, this is what's very interesting. Currently, the Russians are working on solidifying control of Kurakhivka and also broadening their attacks westwards. Russian sources, some of them are claiming they are already present in Vovchansk, which would mean, giving a lot of support to Ostrivska when you think about it, because you can see how beforehand it was sort of this preliminary outlet for the Russians, but by receiving that sort of support from the northern flank, it's going to make it easier for the Russians to build up over there and in the future assault Kurakhove. But regardless of that, Vovchansk, that's important because it indicates that the Russians are continuing with their pace in attack over here, with the objective of forcing the Ukrainians out of another salient, because the Ukrainian withdrawal from Hirnik and Kurakhivka, it was important in the sense that it prevented a lot of the battalions there from being encircled or being fired upon significantly during their withdrawal had it occurred any further down the line. But it's not the end of the Ukrainian resistance in a sort of salient, or one that is sort of closed off on two axes, and then on the third one by the reservoir, because here you have the reservoir and then you have the Russian pressure coming from the north and from the east. The Ukrainians, of course, want to drag their feet over here because they don't want to give the Russians access to a lot of depth, which leads directly towards Andriivka and then also to the south to Kurakhove. So that's the rationale. They're just trying to buy time using the space over here. And this area actually is pretty fruitful in individual defenses, but also it is becoming more and more narrow, and the Ukrainians here are fatigued from the large-scale fighting that occurred in northern Hirnik and the constant withdrawals. But regardless, now you have the initial reports from the Russian side of efforts to enter Stepanivka. So far, none of that is confirmed. Same thing with Ilinka. None of that yet is being reflected on my map because there's no proof of that. But just know that the Russians are mentioning those facts. Here you have Russian advance, which amounts to 1.5 square kilometers. This is in southern Novoselidivka. The Russian forces here are continuing to expand, and the objective is a lot of it to go southwards to provide this northern pressure to force the Ukrainians out of Elinka, Beretsky over here as well. And that would be a means by which to further cut down on the salient. But a lot of it is also happening a bit to the west with Novodmitrivka. We already knew about the large-scale Russian advance here over the past week. Actually, it was on October 28th when the 35th Marine Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers here. So the 35th Brigade, its objective is to secure the northern flank for the Ukrainian garrison that is currently located in this salient. 35th Marine Brigade is located over here, and as opposed to sort of like put pressure on villages that the Russians are trying to occupy, target individual Russian squads that are sensed, or break up columns that are trying to launch large-scale assaults. Russian sources, they claim that they were able to capture Kremina Balka. This is very interesting, and perhaps it will be verified later on overnight by Ukrainian sources like Petrenko or Deep States, but I'm not recording it at that time. What's being mentioned by Russian sources is that due to their advance from Novodmitrivka, they were able to utilize the local ravines or tree lines to enter into Vovchansk. And then by default, that meant that the Ukrainians were sort of squeezed out of Kremina Balka, and it was taken over in the process, in addition to the rest of western Novoselidivka. What this would mean is a really important Russian forward base, because you have not just one village, but actually three villages that are very close together, well connected by various routes, and then also branch out really well into nearby regions. To the south, you have the rail line that branches out towards the reservoir. To the west, you have a paved road, which comes from Novodmitrivka to Sontsivka, and then also this local route from Vovchansk to that same village. And Sontsivka is really important as a village because it acts as a glue, I would say, between the current Ukrainian salient and all of the rear assets of the Ukrainians in the midterm are really trying to preserve. Most importantly, Andriivka and its suburbs. And what it means is that right now, based on what's confirmed, the Russians are only about 4 kilometers away from there, but the situation could, of course, change depending on what's going on in Vovchansk and the routes that branch out from it. So definitely keep an eye out for the way that events culminate over here. Additionally, there are once again unconfirmed reports of Russian expansion west of Vishneve, which would include this local hill in between the two chains of villages. Those villages are, of course, adjacent to the rail lines that connect further to the north. You can't really see it on the map. This is really important for the Ukrainians. They really do need to ensure an integrity over here because this is the natural fallback line, these four or five villages. And after that point, you have a large really region of open fields, lack of depth when it comes to defenses until you reach the Novotroitsk and Novo-Olenivka line 7 kilometers westwards. And by that point, you're really knocking on the door of southern direction of Pokrovsk and also the border with Dnipro. And the Ukrainians are aware of this, and that's why recently they've started building up defenses in this vertical direction, which is not yet reflected on the map. But definitely, this is very important for the Ukrainians to retain control over, which is why I'm not changing the map, because it would be a really significant update if it were true, according to Russian sources, that they were able to infiltrate in the direction of Petrivka and Hrihorivka. But again, keep an eye out for it. Looking at Chasiv Yar, we have a slight update because on October 30th, I should have mentioned this in the last video, but you had sappers from, I believe, the 98th VDV division. They installed a TM62 anti-tank mine charge onto the T0504 highway. This occurred, again, now 2 days ago, and it's an indication of a Russian advance of 0.9 square kilometers. This is a part of back and forth fighting that is occurring west of the Donbass Canal ever since the Ahmad forces successfully crossed over and overran the local positions of the Aydar Battalion and 24th Brigade. The Ukrainians have tried to, regroup and conduct localized counterattacks of their own. One of these involved 1.1 square kilometers being retaken, and I believe that was around October 25th. And so they were able to retake the block number 9 quarry and its office nearby. That region was initially taken over by Russian forces, but again, it was so far extended from the initial Russian base east of the canal that it's understandable that there was some sort of stabilization afterwards. Regardless, now the Russian forces are beginning to expand along this specific highway, and it gives them a perfect route towards Stupochki. Stupochki is one of the only villages nearby. And I suppose there's also this sort of idea in the backdrop for the Russians to take over all of the local strongholds, including this quarry over here. You look westwards, there are a few trenches. These trenches are very important because they act as intermediaries between what is currently the line of contact and the entrance into Konstantinivka. And right now, the Russians aren't so keenly looking at what's going on in Konstantinivka, but at some point, it will become relevant after events begin to unfold much more in Chasiv Yar, because just naturally, really losing Chasiv Yar would be a huge loss for the Ukrainians, but they would have the backup line in Konstantinivka, which is really, really well built, including the areas to the east. And so there is an opportunity, due to the Russians crossing over the canal and not being pushed back by now, that they could begin to undermine these Ukrainian defenses before it was really anticipated. But of course, the more important immediate objective is to focus on step-by-step advancing into the residential areas of southern Chasiv Yar and Mykolaiivka, for instance, taking over all of those local heights to establish, at the very least, some sort of equality between the elevation on the Russian and Ukrainian side alike, just because of how highly elevated Chasiv Yar is. And a lot of those regions include the areas that the Russians are now taking over. So that is a very important local advantage that the Russians are beginning to now realize. They also had an attempt by the 24th Brigade, I believe it was 2 nights ago, to try to organize a counterattack. And it was the involvement of an armed column and troops that dismounted. And they were all struck by the 98th VDV division. They released a compilation. Not entirely clear how many vehicles were damaged, but you can see that they were not able to overrun the Russian positions, and that the fighting is basically reflective of what my map is indicating, wherein the Russians are in control of largely open fields, some trenches, some forested regions as well, really with the center being along the highway. Now moving on to the Zhirabets River front, you can see over here a Russian advance amounting to 2.84 square kilometers. The Russians continue advancing along a very specific route. Eventually, they were able to capture Novosadove in addition to Nevske, and once they consolidated control over all the hinterlands in these large open fields, including the Zhiravka beam over here, They really did have a very strong base to begin expanding southwards because to the north you can already see that the line of contact is basically running along the river itself. So in those regions, the goal right now is to find specific points through which it could be crossed and areas that could actually be used as permanent footholds. But I think what's being really focused on is something more important for the Russian side is advancing southwards, advancing along this paved route that connects directly to several villages that are still on the eastern bank of the river. That includes Terny. The Russian forces are now in the northern outskirts of Terny. This was confirmed on November 1st by the 97th Battalion of the 60th Mechanized Brigade because they conducted several FPV strikes onto individual Russian soldiers that were advancing on foot and hiding in the farmland or walking along the fields. And that's, again, confirmation that the Russians were able to push into this area. And after that point, after Terny, you have direct connection to Yampolivka. And then all the way to the south, the largest village remaining would be Torska. And so this is really a Russian plan, a shaping operation that will have long-term implications for the entire Zherebets River bridgehead, including positions around the Serbryansky forest. But for now, really is focused on clearing out the remaining Ukrainian resistance from 97th Battalion, 60th Brigade, 67th Brigade, for instance. And I believe that 67th was actually moved to the National Guard, but that's neither here nor there. And, generally the entire Ukrainian grouping over here. Looking at the Oskil riverfront, this is very interesting. Initial reports coming out from the Russian side of a Ukrainian withdrawal from this region over here, this red rectangle. I've always talked about the fact that I find it rather interesting that the Ukrainians even maintain a presence over here. I suppose it would be to, first of all, buy time by, keeping very small quantities of squads located in the trenches that you see marked over here in yellow or near ponds and tree lines. Because definitely the Russians aren't focusing on pushing them out. And then that also gives the Ukrainians an ability through which to put pressure onto the logistics routes that the Russians have before reaching the actual battlefield. So that includes putting pressure onto Berestove and, more importantly, Pischane. But again, it's very overextended, has the possibility of being cut off. And those forces, whatever, even if they may be small, they definitely are needed elsewhere to engage in the very fierce clashes that are ongoing in Kurakhove. So I don't know which units are actually manning over here. It could be from the 131st Reconnaissance Battalion or even from the 77th Airborne Brigade, but they are now apparently being moved out. But I won't change anything on the map until we receive official confirmation. Now, at the same time, a lot of the focus is in relation to Kurakhove. The Russian MOD actually claims they were able to capture it. They say that the 2nd Motor Rifle Division successfully took it over, and they released a flag-raising video, I think, from an electrical tower in the center of the village. Regardless of that fact, you also have an even deeper Russian advance amounting to 0.8 square kilometers based on this geolocation over here from the 77th Brigade of grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers that were advancing through here. And this again indicates there is a Russian effort that has now successfully cut off the P-79 highway. So now they have access to this bridge that crosses over to Senkove. We'll have to see if the Ukrainians, on their own accord, are now going to actually detonate it from their side of the river. Regardless of that fact, it also means that they're able to advance southwards along the highway towards other villages that are adjacent to the river, like Zakhrishove. And then you have here some more important villages, including Bohuslavka. And really the huge issue here is that an advance directly along the river undermines the entirety of the integrity of the various layers of defense that include what's currently to the east along the line of contact and the various layers, as I said before, of trenches that are really well built around a specific perimeter. You have it over here, for instance, and you have it over here. A lot of them would be caught off guard, caught from the flank, from the rear, and would have a lot of their sort of like arteries of logistics cut off in such a scenario if the Russians were to just continue advancing along one specific corridor and the Ukrainians did not have the ability to cut them off. But for now, we're still looking at the initial stages of this sort of development. And it actually reminds me of how the Russians are now advancing along the Zherebets River, indicating that they are able to concentrate assets in a specific area. And although the Ukrainian resistance there is relatively strong, it's not strong enough to actively counterattack or to put any pressure from the flanks to cut off a certain Russian advance. What they can do is drag out and really buy time, but that's about it. And you also have to look at what this implies for Kolesnikivka and Hlushkivka on the routes to Kupyansk. And speaking of Kupyansk, you have this slight Russian advance south of Stepovo Novoselivka, which the Russians are looking at capturing as one of the final villages before the Russians would have unhindered access to the highway leading into Petropavlivka. Here you can see it. You can see that it's a Russian advance of 0.6 square kilometers based on this geolocation of a destroyed MTLB. It was destroyed by the Ukrainian 40th Artillery Brigade, which is very active around here, especially recently. And then the final update is actually just north of Kucherivka. So the Russians here were able to advance 2.2 square kilometers based on the video from the 2nd Battalion of the 30th Mechanized Brigade that several infantry fighting vehicles organize and launch an attack towards the Russian positions in tree lines that are located very close to this local armory, to some of the local defenses built by the Ukrainians, and to actual houses in northern Petropavlivka. So it is very important because now the Russians are beginning to shift away from combat that was near Sinkivka and near the forest and actually into the first houses of these northern Kupyansk suburbs. And the fighting is really going to drag out. And it's going to be very difficult because of the amount of time the Ukrainians have to prepare and because of the very tight-knit garrison they have in this region. But it shows that now there has actually been Russian progress for really a period of about 2 weeks where they've actually been able to display an ability to continue advancing along this particular axis, amounting to nearly 2 kilometers of an advance. Now, to finish off, you have this video from the ENOT drone group. It's from the 136th Motor Rifle Brigade. That's a Russian unit, which is now split between the Vovchansk front and with defending in Kursk. So I don't know exactly how it's split, but I believe that the 2nd Battalion of that unit is still operating in the Vovchansk region. I want to see if I can find the unit on my map over here. Yeah, I can see that it's over here, but just know that it's split. It's not entirely in Kursk. So they released a video of just conducting, I believe it was FPV strikes or drones dropping grenades onto Ukrainian soldiers along this particular tree line. This tree line is very close to the international border. This is a part of a Ukrainian efforts to gradually retake open fields in areas that were previously under very strong Russian control, but over time the presence here has been reduced just due to being overextended and due to those forces being moved elsewhere, either to Vovchansk directly or to Kursk, as you may have understood by now. And so this is just confirmation of that Ukrainian advance, which amounts to 2.25 square kilometers. Besides that fact, you do have the Ukrainians very active right now in Vovchansk city itself. A lot of talk about successful Ukrainian counterattacks, but in terms of the geolocations, I'm really waiting for those to come out. And the one that we have actually seen come out is from an area that was already known to be under Ukrainian control. And in that footage, you can see how the Ukrainians from the 57th Brigade motorized unit, they were able to storm Russian positions near these warehouse regions, near Zornova Street, and they took at least 5 Russian POWs per the video itself showing that. And then Deep State, they claimed that the unit was able to take 15 POWs. So this would be in an area that was already under Ukrainian control in Vovchansk, but definitely keep an eye out for what develops with the aggregate plants, given the reports in the backdrop of Ukrainian attempts to counterattack over here, really as they try to take advantage of the lack of Russian Air Force activity over here and the movement of a lot of units away from their original garrisons in the Belgorod area towards areas to the west around Kursk, which is completely understandable, but then it led to the effect of the Russians really dialing down their offensive activities in the Vovchansk region, understandably. And so, for instance, you have the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment. It's not operating in Vovchansk or anything like that. We actually have footage of them released right now of them conducting strikes onto Ukrainian positions in Ruskoye. Let's see and zoom in on it. On Ruskoye Porechnoye. But that's it for today. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.